It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to applaud the Korean government and the thought leaders and business elites of this country to be preparing themselves for the fourth industrial revolution, for all of the benefits and the challenges that we will have to face. I think that many countries are currently not doing enough, in particular my own country, which is China. All of us will be facing some of these challenges. Now, it is one thing to be prepared for the benefits that technologies will bring. We have heard until now the two sessions which have highlighted the great benefits that productivity and technology and innovation can bring to humankind. And I'm afraid that, despite the fact that the title of our topic today is New Opportunities and New Challenges, looking at the agenda, there seems to be a disproportionate weight on opportunities. So I have to take this chance to talk about the challenges. And not only are they challenges, they can potentially be threats. While we have to be optimistic, this is no time for complacency. Because technology in the past, in the historical, until recently, has brought many great things, including higher income and new jobs. But this is one of the unprecedented first time that in the greatest technological capacities that we have seen, again, which we have illustrated previously, we are at the lowest of the relative incomes, the greatest of global inequality. So this is no time to be complacent. Now today, our media channels are dominated by the sweeping, subversive movements around the world. Populism, anti-globalization, nationalism, from my other country, Brexit, disunity and disharmony. Now I think what this is really about is discontent and fear. It's a manifestation of a global level discontent. What are we discontent about? We are discontent about the rising inequality. We are unhappy about existing establishments and about unfair opportunities. What do we fear? Well, we fear robots taking our jobs. We fear slower growth, and we fear the lack of opportunities for our children. So this kind of sentiment is not too uncommon in history. I've been reading a little bit of the post-war history recently, and I found that in the 1960s, post-war, everyone was kind of tired of the hardship during war, so there were new ideas, new spirit, new dynamism, and everyone was merry and happy and created new things. What happened in the 70s? Well, of course, we got hit by an economic crisis, but it was more overcome by reduced expectations and lost illusions. So we might just be observing this events around the world today, and this grappling sense of uncertainty, we might just be living the end of a euphoric decade. Now, I'm a macroeconomist, so I want to bring us back to the economy-wide implications. Technology is going to penetrate our everyday lives, as it has already, but so does the macroeconomy. And only about a decade ago, well, it seems a little bit shorter than that, but a decade ago, the world was kind of hit by a global financial crisis, and Korea, this country itself, also suffered quite a bit in the process. So we must understand what are these implications of technological revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, going to matter for the economy, for jobs, and therefore for everybody's lives. I want to start by showing you 3 macro trends. Now, at the same time that technological revolution is happening, there's something different about the macroeconomy today. The first is a steady decline in the world interest rate. So this is the real interest rate, okay, the US, but this is pretty much different countries, UK, US, Germany, Europe, etc., we have seen is that since the 1980s, the real interest rate has been on the decline, and we have not seen it go back. Now, for those who are in the business community, you would understand that when interest rates are almost at the zero level, the zero lower bound, that makes economic policies, like monetary policies, very difficult to stimulate the economy. But I want to highlight that this is one of the trends that we're seeing. The second is rising inequality. This is coming from the famous works by Thomas Piketty, the once obscure French economist, who rose to fame after writing a book almost equivalent to Marx's Das Kapital. This is the top 0.01% of the income share. As you can see, it has steadily increased, and it has now overtaken some of the worst times of inequality in the past. So now we are at a very unequal era where the top elites are garnering or gathering a larger share of wealth over time. So that inequality is also a rising trend. The third is what we call in economics job polarization. Now, ever since the crisis, what we have observed is that, yes, the employment in many parts of the world, such as the US, has come back. There has been the hollowing out of the middle class, so to speak. So basically, routine job workers, those of the middle skill level, have been displaced by automation, and as you can see that the routine occupations are on the steep decline since 1975, and non-routine occupations are on the rise. So that is one of the trends where you have, when the crisis have brought about a lot of unemployment, the jobs that have returned are not the ones of the middle skill, but the more high skill level. So that is a job polarization. Now, I want to talk about the challenges and the risks that technology can bring about to the economy, because yes, we understand that automation can displace many of the routine workers, as we have seen, but guess what? As we have mentioned, the new discoveries or new inventions along the lines of AI will actually displace also non-routine workers. So right now, I think according to a McKinsey Institute report, at least 50% of the jobs can be displaced right now. That will be a higher share for developing countries, which I'll come back to. But when we think about non-routine jobs, potentially those jobs of people with greater education skill will also be displaced. That does pose as a potentially big problem. Now, I want to show these three graphs along with a couple other that exist for the macroeconomy, because there's something that has fundamentally changed. And I want to argue that much of it has to do with technology. Now, today, the challenges that I've just mentioned about anti-globalization and Brexit, or that kind of deep discontent, a lot of people are blaming trade as the cause of inequality. But that is actually factually wrong. Globalization is not the most important cause of inequality. It is actually technology. At least 60% of the rise in inequality is driven by technology. Now, of course, when we talk about trade, it's very easy to be used as a political narrative or political weapon, right? Because the politicians can just say, we can blame this on somebody else. It's us versus them. But if you think about technology, who are we going to blame it on? The robots? I'm not sure they're going to be held accountable for rising inequality. But the truth is, globalization has brought us way more benefits and prosperity than it has cost us in terms of inequality. But productivity and technological change has been a driving factor. But it is a tricky issue when it comes to thinking about inequality. And the reason is that if we didn't give people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, who I went to school with, the right kind of incentives to innovate, then the productivity or change or technology wouldn't have taken place in the first place. So there's a big trade-off between reducing inequality and reducing incentives. So that is a very difficult problem to tackle. And then thinking back on the interest rate issue, if we go back to this first graph, the declining interest rate, technology could be one main factor explaining this. Why? Because in today's companies, Uber, Facebook, some of these new companies that we will be hearing from, the valuation of the company is a lot less dependent on physical capital and investment. Investment becomes a smaller and smaller share of the entire value of the company compared to the past, where manufacturing companies, making shoes or making steel or cement, the marginal cost of making an additional shoe is very different from the marginal cost of making another copy of Microsoft, which is now at zero cost. So that shift of reduced investment demand is one of the main factors causing the decline in interest rate. And that, by the way, has caused a problem to the economy, which is that when we get into a crisis, there is no more room for stimulus. But this is deeply linked and intertwined with technological problems. So, challenge number one, let me ask everyone here, if now goods can be manufactured for free, how are developing countries going to take off? Now, China might be the last country in the world that has been able to ride the wave of industrialization, create jobs, and build a phenomenally large middle class. In most other parts of the world, there will be a hollowing out of the middle class, which we haven't seen in China. And the reason is that we had a lot of labor. I'm coming from China. China's labor was cheap, so there was no motivation to adopt labor-saving technologies. That was able to help China create a huge middle class. But that's not true for a lot of other countries. Now, a lot of other countries still need to be going through industrialization, building middle class, building prosperity, but what used to be seen as offshoring, where advanced economies moved a lot of the industries into developing countries, and then once developing countries became a developed country, they moved their industry into another developing country, and so on and so forth. That's not going to happen anymore because there's now going to be reshoring back to the countries because of automation and because of technology. So if manufacturing goods can now be produced for free, what's going to happen to all the other developing countries? Now, China is still very much a big challenge because, as you see, that, in fact, so this is a graph that graphs GDP per capita on the left, on the horizontal axis, which is income per capita, and on the x-axis is the risk of being automated. You'll see that the poorer countries will meet a greater challenge in terms of susceptibility to automation than more advanced economies. So poorer countries are at the risk. So something like 75% of jobs in developing countries are at the risk of automation, as opposed to 50% in advanced economies, right? So the richer you are, the more safe you are. And this country is already an advanced economy, especially technologically oriented, so that some of this challenge doesn't apply. But we still have to think about the rest of the world. Now, one of the biggest, most momentous things that has happened in the last century is that global inequality has actually reduced. Now, people like Thomas Piketty and all these people in the US and Europe, we argue a lot about rising inequality because we're looking at within countries. And it's true that within rich countries, inequality has gone up. But if you look around the world, global inequality has actually gone down. And that's because of the rise of countries like China and India. So the pressing question is, with automation, can we still bring global inequality down, or is it just going to be another big divergence, right? So even, for a country like China, labor costs are rising, but capital goods are also getting cheaper over time. So between 1993 and 2007, the price of robots declined by more than 80%. So this will be a big threat to China. Some of these jobs will automatically be replaced and displaced. So apart from developing countries and that paradox, the second challenge is really what's going to happen to our jobs? What will society do when these jobs that can be automated will disappear? What can countries and how can policies be designed to prevent that problem? I think very much of the spirit of this conference is also to brace ourselves for more uncertainty and prepare ourselves for the challenges. So looking a little bit back in history, now this is not the first time that technology or so-called technological unemployment, which is a term that was coined by Keynes. As you can imagine, this is not the first time that this worry has come to the fore. Okay? This has always been a cause of anxiety, from the textile looms to the steam engine to the discovery of electricity into computers. That has created a significant anxiety about job losses throughout history. But there's always two views, which is an optimistic view and a pessimistic view. The optimistic view is that technology will not so much displace existing workers, but it will actually create many, many more opportunities. So in the past, technology has managed to create many, many more jobs than the jobs it had displaced. Now, just taking agriculture, for example, in the US, 30% of the employment was employed by the agriculture industry for a long period of time, and that now is only at 2%, and that's largely due to automation. Things are fine. Actually, US employment grew in the last 50 years, and many, many new tasks were created, which meant that technology displaced some workers, but it actually created many, many more kinds of jobs, more different kinds of jobs, more complex jobs. Many of these jobs, of course, are more beneficial for high-skilled labor, but they created many more opportunities. However, the second time around, which is the computer revolution since the 1980s, technologies did not do the same thing. Technologies did not do the same thing as what it had done in the past by creating new kind of tasks. In fact, the new sectors that have emerged, 50% of these new sectors are related to IT industries. But in the 1980s, about 8% of US workers were able to shift into these new sectors. By the 1990s, only 4.4% of these workers in the US shifted into new sectors related to technologies. And by the 2000s, only 0.5% of workers shifted into industry related to IT. But 50% of the new sectors were created were IT sectors. So obviously, this time around, technology has not created as much employment as the past. Now, what is the pessimistic versus the optimistic view when it comes to creating jobs? Well, this is kind of simple to understand. The optimistic view is, well, there's technology, so productivity rises. The question is, what do firms do when productivity rises? Well, it can either increase output and employment, because let's say that the higher productivity gets passed down as lower cost to the consumers. So things are cheaper. If things are cheaper, people will demand more. If people demand more, there will be more jobs created. So technology can actually create more jobs. The pessimistic view is that higher productivity is going to lead to higher profits. The firms will hoard the higher profits, create monopolies, higher prices, and there will be less demand, and there will be less employment. So a lot of what's going to happen to technology also depends on firm choices, and here is where the government can actually play a key role. So that's challenge number 2, which is what is going to happen to society when these jobs are going to disappear. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the options, and options for policymakers, options for countries. We've heard we've referred to in the previous presentations about skill, about mismatch of employment and skill. And I just want to show you one thing first, which is that the higher skilled laborers are going to benefit in the new era. So this is kind of an estimate going from now until 10 years later, the kind of jobs that will be created. And you can see that higher qualification skills will have much more new jobs and be demanded more, whereas lower skilled laborers will be demanded less. Now let me just point to something in history that has caused a lot of confusion to people, which is that part of the rising inequality, many people are, of course, blaming on technology, but we have to be a little bit more specific. And the specific cause of inequality is due to something called the skill premium. The skill premium has risen, which is that the wages of the high skill compared to the wages of the low skill, that premium has risen over time. Now, why has that been the case? Well, the reason is that technology so far has been skill biased. What that means is that as technology increases, the ones that benefit the most are the higher skilled laborers. We saw that from the Tesla example. We're going to hear that about coding. The people who are equipped with education and the skill level to embrace the technological change and be better able to use them, these are the highly skilled laborers, and they are being demanded more the more technology rises. But the problem is that even though the demand for high-skilled labor has increased, guess what happened to the supply of skilled labor? In the US, the supply of high-skilled labor has not risen as fast as the demand of high-skilled labor, which is the reason why the skill premium increased. So that comes down to the question of education. Rather than blaming it on technology for the rise of inequality, we have to look into what's going on with education. Now, it is true in the US that since the 1970s, the acquisition of higher skill attainment and higher schooling has actually flattened and also fallen off. So that means that as technology blossoms and we need more and more skilled people, the supply of skilled people in the US has not caught up. And this is the reason, when you have greater demand than supply, that the price of skilled labor has risen. So that is one thing to be very cognizant of and conscious of, which is that education is very much at the core. Now, I want to bring back a little bit to my country because, the organizers also asked me to talk a little bit about China, a topic which I will return to. But a really interesting phenomenon, speaking about education today in China, is that we had something very different, very radically different from the rest of the world in the beginning of the 1980s, which is we had the one-child policy. Now, I'm from the one-child policy generation. None of my friends have any siblings. I'm also an only child. And I kind of joke about this with my parents, and also, I've written about this in many research, what I call the quantity-quality trade-off. What that means is that when we used to have a lot of children, well, fine, a lot of children can take care of the parents, and then you can rely on many, many children. But what happens when you have only one child? Well, you have only one child, so the quantity reduced, so you have to raise their quality. And that shows up as a massive investment in education in today's only child families. Now, I've looked at this. We spoke about data in the previous session. I've looked at 40,000 households in China from the urban areas, and the one-child policy was very strict, so all the households had only one child. 25% of the entire household expenditure every year goes into educating one child. So a quarter of your spending goes into educating one child. Now, we've seen that because of the one-child policy, two things happened. One is human capital acceleration was very rapid. So we're about 40% more educated than if I had another sibling. If I had, let's say one brother or one sister, or if I had a twin, then I would be 40% less educated than I am today. Okay, so there's a massive amount of education investment going. The second interesting thing is that there has been more gender equality, because I'm an only daughter. Now, if I had 3 brothers, and if we were poor, then of course my brothers get educated first, right? But since there's only one child, it doesn't matter whether you're a daughter or a son, you're going to be educated anyways. So we saw that the higher schooling, so college education attainment rate between girls and boys, the gap immediately closed 10 years after the one-child policy. And also the returns to schooling for girls is actually higher than the returns to education for boys. I mean, that's also understandable because girls started from a lower level. So that's kind of the unique natural experiment that China has been able to do at a very large scale, and that shows that human capital accumulation is very important, and I want to argue is at the root of one of the solutions to the kind of jobless technological unemployment challenges that we face today, which is that we need to have more educated people. The second thing that can be done is, of course, to better match skill with the kind of jobs that are available. Now, I just spoke about China and the fact that we have so many educated people, but it doesn't help if we have everybody who is a college graduate and no jobs, right? Or not the right kind of skills. So there was quite a phenomenon in China recently where we had, students from a very famous university graduated and selling Chinese pancakes on the streets because they just couldn't find a job. And the reason is that we had a huge expansion of college education. So there were a lot of very, very highly skilled, kind of highly educated students graduating, but there were not enough jobs. And at the heart of this is a mismatch between what's available, the skills that are available, and the jobs that are available. So the government can do a lot more in terms of matching them. I'm quite optimistic, this is a slight diversion, of the sharing economy where you have the technologies creating the platform so that jobs and skills can match by themselves through the platforms rather than through market forces, which we know are imperfect. And a lot of today's unemployment is caused by frictional unemployment, which is the fact that jobs and skills cannot be matched perfectly in labor markets. But if we think about extending, the Uber kind of platform, the sharing platform, to thinking about labor markets too, potentially that can also ease some of the mismatch between skill and job availability. So I just want to also highlight a few things that what are the new jobs that we can bring about? There are a lot of new jobs in different sectors. So the green sectors, climate-related sectors, environmental-related sectors, will have 700,000 jobs in the US, as well as industrial sectors. Healthcare will create 4 million new jobs needed in the US, and this is largely due to population aging, etc. In the EU, there will be 8 million jobs, of course, in the IT sectors. IT sectors will create a lot of jobs through security analysts, data scientists, et cetera, et cetera. The government needs to be aware of the kind of new jobs that can be created at the same time. The third solution is that maybe this fear is a little bit exaggerated of automation. The truth is not all jobs that can be automated will be automated. And the second thing is, if we are richer, because we have robots to do our housework, to do our cooking, I don't know what else it can do, but a lot of the things that can free up our time, we can enjoy more leisure. If we enjoy more leisure, then we can also demand more services. Now, services create a lot of jobs. Now, a funny anecdote, but it's actually true, is that on LinkedIn, I think everyone knows what LinkedIn is, the fastest growing occupation recently is Beachbody trainers and Zumba teachers. Zumba is a kind of dance, right? So that's the highest kind of growing occupation. That means that if we have more leisure, we can consume more leisure because we have robots to do some of the stuff that we don't want to do, we will start to enjoy more entertainment. We'll go out to have more, eat out more. We will have more time to shape our bodies and take tango lessons. So that will create a lot more opportunities for the service sectors, which are substantially less at risk of being automated. So that is something to be optimistic about. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about China. Now, China is a remarkable story. It's brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But its model is not easy to copy. And as I've just highlighted in the first few minutes in my talk, what it was able to do or achieve through industrialization is, I'm afraid, not going to be replicable for other emerging markets in developing countries in the future. Now, now for those of you who are technologically savvy, we know that China has been quite advanced in some aspects of technology. I find this to be fascinating because I think it is the first time in history that a country with only 25% of US GDP is able to leapfrog and be more advanced in certain critical areas of technology than the US is. And I personally have a lot of experience this through the consumer sector about the kind of innovative activities that are happening in China right now through these consumer-oriented technologies is quite interesting. Now, fintech, I'm a strong believer of the fintech revolution, especially in China. For those of you who are interested in future trends, in engaging with China in terms of technology, and the reason is that consumers are much more, first of all, they were able to leapfrog from building up a very sophisticated financial system and going straight to using the mobile phone as an apparatus to manage their wealth and manage their savings. So consumers and small, medium enterprises are already turning to alternative providers for access to payments, credit, investment, insurance. Now, 40% of Chinese consumers use alternative payment methods compared to 4% in Singapore. As you can see, this is just comparing different kind of countries. China is at the very forefront of using highly disruptive technologies to access their finance. And 35% are using fintech to access insurance products as compared to only 1% to 2% in Southeast Asian markets. Now, this has a real consequence not only for consumers but on the economy as a whole. One of China's biggest problems today is that households are not kind of winning the GDP race, right? Households' income share is declining over time. And one of the reasons that households put a lot of their saving into banks, but the banks pay them almost zero real rate of return in the last 2 decades. Now, we know that China grew remarkably fast, very fast growth, but the real return to saving to the Chinese consumers have on average been about zero. But with the access to fintech, which is why it's becoming so popular, just through the mobile phone, you can choose whatever kind of wealth management products you want to have and immediately change your savings and move into saving into their kind of products or financial assets that offer them a much higher return. So what this is saying is that technology is able to help households circumvent the government policies of financial repression. By suppressing the interest rate for households, they're able to kind of circumvent and avoid that by embracing a fintech revolution. So I think that's a big kind of opportunity, and here are some examples of Alipay, which is, very ambitious to become global, and versus, WeChat or debit cards. And you can see that there's a high level of penetration of mobile payment methods in China. Okay, I'm going to talk about this. China has a few global companies. BAT, very ambitious. Alibaba is, developing international ecosystem that encompasses targeted marketing, logistic, payment services, and cloud computing. And they definitely have ambitions to go worldwide. In Europe, in America, they're offering a lot for Chinese tourists. And they also are acquiring a lot of companies around the world to gain exposure. BAT, the B part of the BAT, Baidu, is extending overseas services, Baidu Wallet in Asia, and it has made aggressive moves into several places, especially O2O businesses, food delivery, ticketing, entertainment, Uber, etc., and plans to invest $3.2 billion more between 2015 to 2018. Tencent is the social media giant and the WeChat owner, investing and diversifying into hundreds of companies focusing on gaming, mobile money, and artificial intelligence. Examples: $90 million funding for Indian healthcare information provider, or for a Finnish game maker, really positioning themselves to be on the forefront of the gaming industry, and also massive investments in car-sharing apps. So this leads me to the final remark and observation, which is that we see that there are some companies in China trying to become global. Now, many companies in your country have successfully become global. The overwhelming question today is China going to take up a new global leadership, right? That must be on the minds of everybody, especially given the what America is doing these days in terms of receding from the forefront of the world stage. Now, without much choice, China has been pushed, at least in some aspects, of the global responsibility onto the world stage, including climate and including spreading economic prosperity around the world. The two questions are, will China take on that leadership? And if so, what will that leadership look like? What are the defining characteristics of that leadership? Now, of course, the underlying premise is that China still has to grow, right? If there's a huge China implosion, growth stops, I don't think there will be a question of whether China will be a global leader or not. I'm relatively optimistic about the first question, which is that I think that China's growth will sustain, and there will be no financial implosion, so everyone can rest assured. But since this is not a talk about economics, I will not in detail explain to you why. But if that is the case, I think we need to think a little bit more about what the defining characteristics of the Chinese leadership is going to look like. Now, the Belt Road Initiative, which I'm sure many of you in the room is aware of, is one of the instances where China is going to export a new global model. What I envision in this new global model is that China is going to take the role of a coordinator, an enabler, a platform, providing a platform on which many countries can come on and do things together and spread shared economic prosperity around the world, because a country has to supply a critical missing input. Without that input, there will be no such things taking place. And as we know, there's a huge, large infrastructure gap in the world today. Are we going to rely on America to do it? Well, America has its own infrastructure challenges, and the bipartisan debates about taxes makes it very difficult for America to even upgrade, the already backward, Kennedy Airport. So that's going to be very difficult. But America's influence in the world has been achieved through its multifaceted exportation of values, culture, and unique moral insights. The country, America, had some bit of historical ambivalence after the wars when it took the stage of the global leadership, just like China is having its historical ambivalence. But it was able to gain its legitimacy because it was exporting certain kind of values and upheld a very specific moral banner, moral universalism. Is China going to do that? I don't think so. I don't think that China shares necessarily exactly the same kind of values about democracy and about, having unique moral insights around the world. And I don't think that it is its intention to use moral universalism as a way to spread its influence. For thousands of years, China has actually used its own cultural preeminence and their ability to maintain regional peace and order was through informal systems of tributary of relationships and outright demands for respect and submission. Now, this country itself is also well aware of that. There was very little need to actually engage a real military force when China could dominate psychologically by its achievements and its conducts. And it has sought to induce respect rather than conversion. And its role has never been missionary. So China's calling may be very, very different from what has made America take up the US, the stage. So is China the dream or the nightmare? I think it would be a bad thing to do, and it would do nobody good to freeze it out of the global system simply because we fear this haunting China image. Instead, the world should work out how to realign China's interest with the interest of the rest of the world. There's still many projects to be done, including infrastructure, and including poverty alleviation, tackling the climate change. But all of that needs a curator, an enabler, a leader, and a coordinator. It's kind of like an orchestra, right? The players can be coming from anywhere around the world, and the conductors can actually change. Conductors can move. That's not the important thing. Who is the conductor? But the important thing is that the orchestra plays. It plays music, and hopefully it will be melodic and beautiful music. And together, thank you. Thank you very much.